Today we're going to learn how to solder. Who can tell me what soldering is? You're using a filler metal in between them, and it melts at a lower temperature than the other two metals. So we're going to be working with silver solder, and you should have 3 different kinds. The other thing it's important to know is that we have hard, medium, and easy solder, right? What do you think that means? It's the temperature that it melts at. Because if you solder something and then you add another piece to it at the same temperature, what's going to happen? One might fall apart. So that's why we have 3 different levels. So which one do you think melts at the highest temperature? Hard melts at the highest temperature, and then medium, and then easy. It's also important to know that once you flow solder, it actually melts at a slightly higher temperature the second time. The first step for your ring would be to cut out all the pieces. These curved pieces, you can see, you'll have to saw out. I would suggest doing that first. It's going to be much easier to saw when you have a larger piece of metal to hold on to. If you cut it down and then try to saw them out, it's going to be harder to do. So I've already done that. I've already cut all of my pieces out. You are going to use some of this extra black material to make a solder sample, so I just saved one of those pieces. And the very first thing that you will do before you start soldering the ring is to take this piece and just put a tiny piece of each type of solder on there so you can watch them flow. So first thing I need to do is turn the torch on. The other thing that I need to check is what torch tip I have. You're going to want to use a 1. So I have this piece set up. I'm going to use flux. Flux is what you put on the metal to prevent it from oxidizing, because if the metal oxidizes, then the solder will not flow. If the solder gets dirty, it won't flow. If there's a gap, the solder won't flow. Everything has to be perfectly situated for solder to work well. So I'm going to go ahead and cut. I usually cut into a lid or a small container because otherwise the pieces of solder tend to fly everywhere. So I'm going to cut a small piece. I'm just going to dip it in flux and use it to pick up this, which is hard solder. So I'm going to put hard solder there. Now I'm going to cut a piece of the medium solder into the container. Last, I will cut a piece of easy solder. So in this first thing that you're going to do is just a solder test. So you're just going to see these flow. And it'll happen really quickly. So you can start with a little bit softer of a flame. You shouldn't hear a loud noise. If you start with too aggressive of a flame, it's just going to blow your solder all over the place because there'll be too much air. I use my left hand to hold the torch so that I'm able to use my right hand to adjust things with the pick. So the solder is going to turn white and then brown, and then it's going to turn clear, and it's going to flatten out and it won't bubble anymore. So do you see that it's clear right now? So I'm just heating. Okay, so there goes easy, there goes medium, and there goes the hard. I'm going to go ahead and prepare all of the pieces before I solder them. So after you do the solder sample, your next step for this is going to be to make the ring band. This piece is longer than you will need, so you may need to cut it down. And if you want to, you can actually take string or wire and measure your finger and then cut it to be the right length, but you don't have to do that. Once you have it cut down to the appropriate size, you're going to make sure that you peel the paper off of it. So I have this strip. I want to make sure that it's completely flat. So I'm just going to tap it from both sides. One thing that's really important when you're soldering two pieces of metal together is that they fit perfectly together. So right now this was cut with the shear, and what happens when you use the shear or really any cutting device like that to cut is that it pinches the end just a little bit so it's thinner. So I need to file or sand until that goes away. The easiest way for me to do that, because it's actually really difficult to keep this straight when you're filing. If you use a file, your hand tends to curve. So the easiest way for me to do it is to tape emery paper to the table and do it like this. Otherwise, the point where I connect is going to be smaller than the rest of the metal and it won't be as strong. This is 400. You could use 220. It's also important that you try not to rotate your hand when you're doing that you hold it as steady as you can. You could also do this on the belt sander with it turned off. Sometimes I use both hands to try to hold it really steady, because that's what's most important, is that your hand's not moving. If it's not perfectly flat, then there'll be gaps when I line them up and the solder won't fill the gap. So this first connection that I'm talking about that you're making with the ring band is called a butt joint. It's joining the edge of the metal to the edge of the metal, like this. We'll also talk about two other types of joints, but this is the first one that we're starting with. This is the next step. Once I have the ends sanded and I can tell that they're flat, and sometimes you can check them by putting them against something flat to make sure that they're flat, and if you don't see any light, then they should be flat. I'm gonna bend this into a triangular shape because I don't need it to be a circle right now. I just want to have a good connection where my seam is. So I'm gonna push down in the center to make a V, and I'm gonna use my flat nose pliers to bend the sides. And I just want these to be connected really well. And if they don't line up perfectly, I might need to adjust this way or this way. And I'm definitely gonna push over and under to overlap them so that I can get them fitted together really well with tension. So I wanna make sure that when I run my finger across it, it's perfectly lined up. I shouldn't feel one edge sticking up more than the other. Sometimes it's uneven and I need to tilt it a little bit so that one side comes up or down. I can do that by holding it with my hand and then adjusting the other side with the flat nose pliers. So once I have this ready, I should be ready to solder, but before I can do that, I need to do something to this piece. What's gonna happen when it gets heated? It's going to expand and it's probably just gonna fall down. So in order to keep it together, I'm going to use binding wire. We have this in the studio available for you to use. So I have this piece of wire. I'm gonna start where the seam is on the bottom, in the center of the wire, and I'm going to pull it as tightly as I can to the ring, and then I'm going to twist it. Once you have that twisted a little ways, then you can actually take your flat nose pliers sideways like this and twist it even more. You do want to be careful because you can snap it pretty easily. It shouldn't slide off, so at this point if it's still loose enough to slide, then it's not going to work. And then the other thing I'm going to do is go to the other side, grab it and just turn it gently and make a little bit of a kink. Today we're going to do this ring joint, which is what type of a joint? A butt joint. And then we're also going to do a sweat joint, which is joining surface to surface, which is what we'll do on the top of the ring. I basically designed this so that you had to do all three types of soldering. So I'm going to use the third hand to set up the ring band. I want to solder from underneath because the solder is going to flow towards the heat. So you always want to make sure that you have it set up to where the heat it's going to help pull the solder down. So if I heat from underneath and the solder is here, the solder is going to go down. It also goes with gravity, so I have two things working for me. So what type of solder do you think I should use for this? I can use hard. Hard is sometimes difficult, but since we're going to do multiple seams, I need to use hard. How many pieces of solder do you think I need for this?
One.
One piece of solder is going to be plenty. The easiest way you could use tweezers to pick it up. I think it's easiest to just dip your pick in the flux and it sticks to it. Alright, I am ready to solder now. I made sure I put flux on the seam and on the solder. I'm going to start with a softer flame. You might be able to see the flux a little bit better. So you can see that my solder is kind of flying away right now. It's okay, if that happens I can always push it back. Sometimes I'll just wait until the flux is clear before I do that because it still bubbles and it's still going to move around a lot. It's important to notice that I'm not using the torch up here. I'm using it about halfway down. So everybody see what I'm talking about? And if you touch it with the blue flame, you might melt the copper. So make sure that you're not using that. You should be using right here. This is the reducing part of the flame. So this part is oxidizing and this part is oxidizing. But the reducing part is what's going to allow the solder to flow. In the beginning, I can heat it up here if I need to. I just want that flux. See how it's turning brown now? I want it to lay flat and turn clear. I'm going to make sure that the solder is right on the seam. And see how it's flat? If it starts to turn black, then that means it's getting too dirty. So I'm going to turn the heat up just a little bit. And I'm going to jump back and forth on either side of the seam. You typically never directly heat the solder. You're always heating the sides. So my solder is flowing. I want to make sure it flows all the way. So I'm going to direct it with the pick a little bit. And then I want to pull the heat away. So before this can go into the pickle, the steel has to come off of the ring band. Otherwise it will ruin the pickle. Sometimes the steel wire will get stuck to the ring band, in which case it can sometimes just be yanked off, or we might have to heat it back up to pull it off. Another thing that I need to do to prepare is just to file the edge of this small piece. I'm going to go ahead and now we're ready to do the sweat joint. So this is going to be joining surface to surface. So this is a two-step process. The first step is to flow solder on the smaller piece that I'll be attaching. So I'm going to put flux on there. How many pieces of solder do you think that I will need to use? And what type of solder should I use? I'm going to use hard. One piece is not going to be enough. For sweat soldering, you need a lot of solder. So I'm going to use like 5 pieces on there. Alright. 5 pieces on there. I'm going to heat it up with a softer flame, just like I did on the other ones. I'm definitely going to need to have my pick ready this time. I'm going to wait for the flux to turn clear. Solder tends to pull away from the edges, so I usually like to try to keep it next to the edges. This is one of the times that I am going to directly heat the solder because I don't really have another choice. So the flux is clear, so I can turn the heat up some. And I'm just heating evenly. And I just wanted it to flow all the way across, like it just did. Quit it. So as you can see, this is pickled and clean now. This is a really nice new flat fire brick. I'm also going to use pens to hold it in place because otherwise it might shift. So far we haven't needed to do this because it hasn't really mattered if the piece moved, but when you're trying to connect two pieces together, it's important that you pen the larger one or part of one so that you're able to push them to make them be in the place that you want. So I'm going to flux the area where I want to add this piece. And I'm just going to be able to set it up there. It would be nice if we could heat from underneath for this one, but I like to be able to push down on the piece, which is why I think it works best on just a really flat surface. Softer flame to start with, always. Always gonna bubble and move around. So if I'm trying to heat this piece evenly, where do you think that I'm going to concentrate the heat? In the beginning, I'm just gonna heat evenly for all of them until the flux turns clear. And then once the flux turns clear, that's when I need to start concentrating the heat and you're right, I'm gonna heat the outside of the larger piece because it's gonna take a lot more heat. Do I need to heat the small piece on top at all? No, it's gonna get hot just from being next to the other one. It's gonna heat up really quickly. If I put heat on it, then all the solder is gonna flow onto it. So I wanna make sure that the solder stays between the two layers. So it looks like it's pretty flat now. So I can add a little bit more heat. And I'm just going to pick a corner and jump back and forth in that area. And see how I can see the solder starting to come out? I might need to push down with my pick, but it looks like it flowed all the way around. Sweat soldering takes a lot of heat, more than some of the other types of soldering. And do you see why it's important to have so much solder? Because it has to fill that whole space and come out. And it'll sort of set down too. So right now my ring band is triangular shaped, right? So what I want to do is slide it onto the ring mandrel. And I'm going to use a plastic mallet and tap it and rotate it. The ring mandrel's tapered, so I always want to make sure that I flip it and